Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I must say I'm quite overwhelmed by the talk so far. So I don't I don't know how my talk now fits in. I guess I would have changed it a bit if I had known everything I know now. But yeah, here goes. So I'll start actually at the very other end. I mean, even later than what I'm going to talk about, namely with Roger Joseph Boscovich, the Croatian Jesuit, lived 1718 to 1787. I mean, Boskovic is generally considered to be one of the forerunners of a more modern, let's say, atomic theory. And I'll just sketch briefly a bit about him to give an entrance into what I'm going to talk about. I mean, I don't want to write the history from the future, so to say, but just to give that as kind of sketch, and then delve back into to look at some topics that one can see are important from that perspective. Okay. So Boskovic considered atoms to be points, and these points are understood to be centers of force. In his Theoria Philosophiae Naturalis, Newton and Leibniz are the primary, cited as the primary precursors for him, but he also cites a lot of other precursors, also contemporary thinkers from him, among them Jesuits, a lot of Jesuits who are today quite unknown. He was also educated by Jesuits from the age of around 9, so he has that intellectual background. So here's just a quite long, but still a quotation from Boskovic, where he himself describes his theory. And I just thought I'd quote it in full and then go on. So the primary elements of matter are, in my opinion, perfectly indivisible and non-extended points. They are so scattered in an immense vacuum that every two of them are separated from one another by a definite interval. This interval can be indefinitely increased or diminished, but can never vanish altogether without compenetration of the points themselves, for I do not admit as possible any immediate contact between them. On the contrary, I consider that it is a certainty that if the distance between 2 points of matter should become absolutely nothing, then the very same indivisible points of space, according to the usual idea of it, must be occupied by both together. And we have true compenetration in every way. Therefore, indeed, I do not admit the idea of vacuum interspersed among matter, but I consider that matter is interspersed in a vacuum and floats in it, end quote. And then just briefly how he thinks these points are centers of force, where the force varies between positive, that is repulsive, and negative, attractive, as a function of the distance from the point in a manner than represented by the diagram below. So when you come closer and closer to when the points come closer and closer, the repulsive force goes toward infinity. And he cites Maclaurin and the Maclaurin series. So he has a quite good understanding of the behavior of infinite series and so on. So that's briefly about Boskovic. So in this way, one can see that Boskovic then can combine discrete and continuous characteristics of the physical reality, the discrete with the points and the continuous with the force. And he himself cites atomism as well as corpuscularianism as precursors to his own theory. So what I would like to do here then is just to point, no pun intended, point to one precursor in late scholasticism when it comes to speculations, let's say, or like thinking about kind of point-like structure of matter, namely then Rodrigo de Arriaga. So briefly about Rodrigo de Arriaga, he was born in 1592 in Logroño in Castile, and he entered the Jesuits in 1606 when he was 14 years old. He was taught by Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza, who was himself like a disciple or student, at least, of Suarez. So you have a kind of Jesuit canonical tradition here. He himself taught philosophy and theology in Valladolid and Salamanca in the 1620s. But then in 1625, there was this call for Jesuits to go to Prague to build up the collegium there, which he agreed to do. And then from that time, he was in Prague. One can say that during this time, I mean, in the 1610s and 1620s, the Jesuits had become so numerous, so they often could stay within their own province. So let's, if one takes Francisco Suarez, for example, in 1580, he went to Rome and taught there at the Collegio Romano, which was quite common then, and they were more movable at that time. By the time we come to someone like Rodrigo de Arriaga, the boundaries, let's say, of the Jesuit provinces are more set, and they're often active within just their own province. However, he then changed province once, but then he stayed on in Prague. Primarily, he taught theology in Prague. So just as Suarez, he was mainly a theologian, and he was dean of the theology faculty in 16th. During two times, as you can see. However, then he wrote his Cursus Philosophicus in 1632. That's what I'm gonna primarily talk about. He also wrote the Disputationes Theologicae in Summam Divitomae in 8 volumes, the 9th being composed at the time of his death. But the Cursus Philosophicus then incorporated all of philosophy in 1 volume, so it's not a commentary on Aristotle anymore, although Aristotle is, of course, also important there. The first one who written that kind of complete course in philosophy would have been his teacher, Hurtado de Mendoza. Of course, Suarez is famous for writing a complete work on metaphysics that's not a commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, but note that that's just so to say on metaphysics. Hurtado de Mendoza and here Arriaga wrote a complete course in philosophy. So you have a de anima part, you have a physics part, you have a metaphysics parts, and so on within this course. He became quite famous. There was the saying, Praga videre, Arriaga audire. So to see Prague, to hear Arriaga. And as a Swede, it's interesting to think about the Battle of Prague just at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. He must have been there for that. And one of the Jesuits professor at the college actually led some of the troops to defend parts of Prague. And then the news of the war ended during this siege. He was quite famous. He had a reception. It's said that Descartes was influenced by him precisely on parts where he discussed rarefaction and condensation. Leibniz was influenced by him, and so on. So he had quite a large reception, although I won't go into the reception history to try to detail it between Arriaga and Boskovic here. As I said, I just sketched a bit about Boskovic to give some of the framework for asking questions about late scholastic philosophy. Okay, yeah, as I said, we have this Jesuit tradition here then. So, with Rodrigo de Arriaga, we have a kind of project to inform this tradition of philosophy and theology with new results in natural philosophy. So we have a more clear integration between philosophy and theology on the one hand, and more, let's say, pure natural philosophy, especially mathematics and so on the other. In Suarez, for example, it's hard to see whether he would relate to more of the Jesuit, what we could perhaps sloppily call scientists, working within rather mathematics, astronomy, and so on. But with Arriaga, we really find he has a project, let's say, to bring these together and to make his philosophy and also then theology informed by what one has come to within natural philosophy at large. And he also stresses experience over authority in philosophy. So he writes, for example, quote, experienze extra controversiam nobis longe superiores sunt, end quote. And he's not afraid to draw new conclusions compared to the philosophical tradition. At bottom, though, he defends prime matter, and the rejection of prime matter is a real possibility for Arriaga. When at the very beginning, when he treats prime matter in the physics parts of this Cursus Philosophicus, he explicitly writes against Gomez Pereira's Antoniana Margarita that came in 1554, and their prime matter is rejected. So, quote, recensores non nulli referunt quemdam Gomesium Pereiram in sua Antoniana Margarita negantem omninum materia primam. Sorry, there's an L there, shouldn't be, end quote. However, Arriaga also emphasizes that concept of matter must be adapted so as to accommodate new developments in the sciences, then, as seen above. So he then tries to defend prime matter, but in view of the new developments within the sciences or within natural philosophy. First of all, as to the concept then of matter in Arriaga, or prime matter here, prime matter is unequivocally a substance, according to him. So, quote, primo includitur, then this concept of substance. Primo includitur Deus et omnes substantiae simplices, quia prumo et per se existunt. Includitur etiam materia prima per se existens. Includitur praeterea omnes forme substantiales, que sunt prime radices, iuxta supra dicta. Item unio ob dicta supra, end quote. So we have prime matter, substantial forms, and the union of these then. So I won't go into that here, but it's of course a very interesting question of how Arriaga thinks about the substantial union, the union between matter and form. So prime matter is a substance, but what is a substance according to Arriaga then? Well, he has 7 different definitions of substance that he proposes and rejects, and instead he adheres to this conception then. So the definition of substance is that it constitutes what it calls a first thing. Quod conceptus substantiae est quidquid intrinsicae constituit primam rem, end quote. And he says that this is equivalent to something being first and in itself intended by nature, or that it first and in itself exists, or that it's the first root of all the other. What it primarily excludes then are accidents and artifacts, of course. So that's the contrast. Let's then focus more on the structure of matter, which he says has true and real entity. And this is just commonplace for him. This is from Suarez and from Hurtado de Mendoza also. And it goes along with the rejection of a real distinction between essence and existence. I mean, since matter has some definition, it is some kind of thing, it also has to have its own true real existence. So that's commonplace by the time we come to Arriaga in this tradition. First of all, Arriaga seems to reject the division between prime matter on the one hand and proximate matter on the other, at least in any traditional sense. There is, though, a kind of hierarchy of powers in matter, which he finds in comparison with the powers of the soul. So instead of like prime matter, proximate matter, we have matter, and then it has different powers, and then you can have the hierarchy of powers, and that's somehow isomorphic to the old division between prime and proximate matter. So we have a quote here, quote, ergo quia nostra materia habet realiter, quod et potentia remota et proxima haberent, invenit intellectus noster fundamentum ad distinguendas in ea duus conceptus, proxima et remota, end quote. So since we have these different powers, we have some basis for distinguishing between the proximate and the remote. It can also be noted then that form is directly received in prime matter, of course, since we only have matter in a sense. And that would otherwise be one of the functions, of course, of proximate matter otherwise. Now, matter can exist without substantial form. However, matter does have to have what Arriaga calls modal forms. And those he mentions are ubicatio and duratio. And since there are so many closely related concepts here, I'll just render these ubication and duration. So, quote, dixi substantiali, quia sine aliqua forma modali, nempe sine aliqua ubicazione vel durazione, caso quod distinguator, nequit existere materia, end quote. So matter cannot exist without some where and some when. What about quantity then, and its traditionally related properties like extension and impenetrabilities? So let's start with quantity. Quantity has a complex status for Arriaga. It is, he says, a first accident of matter, though it is also later called a substance. I mean, from a traditionally Aristotelian position, this is almost hard to comprehend. But this has to do with the fact that he actually equates, in a sense, matter with quantity. It is probable, he writes, that matter cannot be without quantity, although, he goes on, it does not involve any contradiction to think of matter without quantity. So he first says that matter cannot be without quantity, and then he goes on to speculate about matter precisely without quantity. And here is the quote from his metaphysics, quote, putes dubitari utrum materia divinitus esse posit sine quantitate. So by the power of God. In nostra sententia nequit, quia sunt idem, in contraria potest, quia nulla est contradictio, end quote. So there's no contradiction still to think of matter without quantity. And actually, he speculates quite a lot about this. But before coming back to the speculations about matter without quantity, let's look at the related subjects of the question of extension and impenetrability. So quantity renders that which is naturally impenetrable, actually impenetrable. Quote, dicendum ergo est ultimum, primarium effectum, so the first effect, quantitas esse, redere impenetrabile per se naturaliter, id in quo est, cum alio eiustem speciei, end quote. However, from reasons of faith, impenetrability does not essentially belong to it. God can then impede the consequences of quantity. So it doesn't essentially follow from quantity and that something is impenetrable. We'll come back to that. Extension, then, to take this other related notion, does not seem to be a consequence of quantity. For extension is nothing, he writes, but having parts outside of parts. Quote, actualis extensio solum dicit habere partes extra partes, sive penetrare possunt sive non. Idioque forma substantialis materialis separata a quantitate potest habere iam extensionem, et si materia distinguaretur a quantitate ad hoc extensa remanere, end quote. So extension is neither dependent on impenetrability nor on quantity, it seems. So as you can see, it still theorizes about matter without quantity. And the argument for separating impenetrability from extension, one of them is from faith, Christ walking through the wall to his disciples with the objection. So this is first the argument against Arriaga's position, and then his defense then. So dices, this is the argument against. He, that is extensio et impenetrabilitate, non sunt duo, sed unus, nam esse unam partem ipsius corporis extra aliam, est formalissime non esse duo corpora in eodem loco. Respondio, so here's Arriaga's position. Dicet non esse duo corpora in eodem loco, includat necessario extensionem, posset tamen dari extensionem corporis et iam se aliud sit penetratum cum illo. Ut cum Christus intravit ad discipulos, retinuit extensionem partium, at tamen fuit penetratum cum muro. End quote. So you can have extension and still have penetrability. So they don't go together. So let's get back to quantity again. So ubication and duration has to come with matter. Matter is then probably, as he writes, inseparable from matter, but Arriaga still theorizes about matter without quantity. And he does not do so with regards to matter without, for example, ubication and duration. So he just takes it for granted that matter comes with ubication and duration, whereas then he at least theorizes about matter without quantity. First then, matter without quantity, it can be extended. Quod unde sine illa, that is ida est quantitate, postet materia est extensa, si Deus det eas ubicationes distinctas, et iam se nihil sit quod eas petat, end quote. So, although its matter would be without quantity, it would still be able to be extended because different, and now it becomes hard to talk about it, different parts of matter, different matter would have different ubicaciones, different ubications, or different where. One could perhaps say location, but that's a different concept for him. So I'm just going to stick with this a bit. Yeah, I'm sticking close to his wording here. So they have different where, so to say, and therefore you have extension. So, and second, matter without quantity could, but would not necessarily have to be reduced to a point. So here we come to quantity and matter and points then. So what would matter without quantity be? Well, it would not necessarily have to be reduced to a point. I take it though that implicitly that means that that would be the natural way to think about it. Quote, licet materia ablata quantitate posset ad punctum reduci, non propteria necessario reduceretur, end quote. He doesn't really explicate more on this. There is this notion of inflated points a bit later on in this tradition. I don't know whether it has to do with that, but this is a fascinating notion that I haven't really gotten my head around. Further, could matter without quantity move? The answer is yes, from, as he calls it, proper gravity, propria gravitate. Quote, se in lapide in aere existenti offereter quantitas, a sua gravitate traheretur deorsum, et facilius forte quam iam, via corpora inferioria nullo modo ei resisterent, end quote. So a body, a stone moving downwards in air, and all of a sudden quantity vanishes. Would it keep falling? Yes, it would, and perhaps even more easily than before, because it wouldn't be resisted by bodies below, or by air presumably here then. So it's quite a fascinating thought experiment. So matter without quantity can move. And matter can then be, there can be a change in the movement also without quantity, not by corporeal agent though. As he writes, quote, nos ut experientia ducet non possumus impulsum imprimere nisi corpori resistenti. Ergo tunc quando talis resistentia non esset, non posset imprimi. Idio dixi ab agente corporeo extrinseco, nam et ab angelo, qui habet virtutem immediate producere ubi id independenter ab impenetratione, optime posset movere. End quote. So, for example, by an angel, since matter still has a where and a when, then if we have some agent that has the ability, the power to immediately produce a where, it could produce this movement, move the thing, then also without quantity. However, what matter cannot do without quantity is to take up, as he writes, divisible space, spatium divisibile. And this is the last notion I just want to bring to the fore. The distinction between divisible and indivisible space, that I though cannot really see how Arriaga makes work together, but that he at least introduces. Precisely with regards to matter devoid of quantity then, Arriaga writes, quote, quinto possit dubitare an ablata quantitate, so without quantity, possit unum punctum materia, one point of matter, verbi grazi occupare spatium divisibile, sicut anima indivisibilis, que occupat locum divisibilem. Respondium non posse, quia illa virtus occupandi plura loca, provenit a perfectione propria subjecti, end quote. So the question is whether matter without quantity can occupy divisible space. And this is why so he has the notion of spatium and locum then, and ubicatio. So I'm trying to keep those separate. So divisible space as the indivisible soul that occupies divisible space, since it informs the whole body. And Arriaga then responds that it cannot, because this power to occupy many locations comes from a proper perfection of the subject, which would then be from the invisible soul. And this kind then of problem, to be perhaps a bit anachronistic, could be thought of as being in the background of the problems that someone like Boskovic is trying to solve. Precisely this, as I started out with, how to bring together an understanding of the divisible and the indivisible, or the what's it called? The digital. I don't find the word now. The digital and continuous. So just to end briefly, Arriaga clearly stands in the scholastic tradition, philosophical tradition, although now in a clearly Jesuit tradition, referring to Suarez and Hurtado de Mendoza. He perceives challenges from the new experimental methods as well as from new philosophy, explicitly mentioning then Gomez Pereira, for example. He uses conceptual tools at his disposal to answer new challenges, and does so in a very intellectually flexible way. And although he doesn't endorse an understanding where matter is reducible to points, he still speculates about this possibility and setting up the framework for the further speculations within this tradition. Thank you for your kind attention.